Okay, good morning, everybody. We are going to get started with today's special event, the book launch for Diverse Educators, a Manifesto. First of all, thank you so much for being here with us. We have people still trickling in to the audience. And I'm really excited about this event because this book has been a part of our lives for about a year and a half now, and it has finally been born. And, you know, when we first started this process, this was very much a conversation about what did we want the book to be? What was our why behind the process? And for us, it was very much around having a document, having a collection of voices who talked about not only diversity in a really passionate way, but also from their own lived experience. And when we were planning this book, we wanted to have a real insight into the worlds of people with protected characteristics, which is why the book is structured around the 9 protected characteristics, and why we wanted people to contribute to that rather than it just being our own voices. And from that, we gathered a superstar team of contributors, 125 people in total, who came together and worked tirelessly to draft their chapters and sub-chapters. And after about 1 million emails and lots of fraught phone calls and sending things backwards and forwards, we had a manuscript. And then honestly, looking at that manuscript the first time made me realize just how important this book could be. So the why around having this document around lived experience was just a small part of it. What ended up happening was a book, a physical thing that you could hold in your hand that you could take to people and say, look, this is what we mean by diversity. This is what we mean by lived experience. And this is what we mean around the educational landscape when it comes to the protected characteristics. So, you know, the fact that this book is now being spoken about so highly is incredible. We've had some wonderful endorsements from some wonderful educationalists. But the most important thing for us is this book going to land in the laps of people who are starting out in education? Because what we want is a sea change in the way we think about diversity, the way we think about the protected characteristics for our colleagues and for our children. And we want that from the starting point of people's careers. So already we've heard potentially this is going to be on people's university reading lists, which is hugely exciting. So going from this kernel of an idea to this wonderful, useful actual article is just something that I'm so proud of, and the writers could not have done a better job with this. To frame this event, I'm going to pass you over to Hannah, who's going to start us off and talk about what we're going to be doing today.
Thank you, Benny, and morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. I know we chose a bit of antisocial time for the UK market, but we have got contributors from all over the world. We didn't want our North American and our Asia colleagues to not be able to join us. So thank you. I can see lots of our contributors and editors are in the chat. When we started Diverse Ed, we did want to create a cohesive, coherent community space, and that's why the collective voice approach to this book was so important. And that's why we wanted our event today to also represent the collective voices. So we've got somebody representing each chapter, some of our chapter editors and some of our contributors representing each chapter to bring to life really each one of those aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion in an inclusive, holistic and intersectional way. That is the kind of the aim for today. Unfortunately, lots of us have not seen the book yet. We're just saying that it feels like it's been born, but no one's seen the baby yet. I think 2 people have received copies, so hopefully the copies will be in the post. So it's also going to really bring to life the things we know that have been written. But for many of you, you've read your section and perhaps the sections from your colleagues in your chapter, but you've not read the whole book. So today is also about joining up the dots between the different sections. I just wanted to share some of the endorsements because, like Benny and I are super proud of everything you have all created, but you've not necessarily all heard the endorsements. Let me just whiz through some of the things that have been said about the book. Dr. Jill Berry, a collaborative tour de force. Claire Birkinshaw, this truly is a remarkable book. Rachel Boyle, a powerful tool. Sarah Brownsword, an impressive collection of voices, viewpoints and ideas. Andy Buck, powerful personal narratives and perspectives. James Coleman lays out a path to move from intention to action. Serda Ferret, there should be a copy of this book in every school. Karen Giles, an upstanding and brave manifesto. Russell Hobby, I learned something new and valuable on every page. Professor Steve Mumby, wow. Teachers and educators will find it invaluable, very impressive. I looked at Benny and I almost started crying. I'm going to hold myself together. Dame Alison Peacock, this is a powerful resource for educators everywhere. Hilary Spencer, these rich experiences shared generously and openly are anchored in a firm belief we are able to change things for the better. Sam Twistleton, its content is as diverse as its subject, giving the reader a huge range of perspectives and food for thought. Dylan Weston, a genuinely extraordinary book. How proud are we of all of you? So I'm now going to hand over to Katie, our first speaker, about age. Katie, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Hannah, and I want to thank you, Hannah, and Benny for herding us all, impossible cats, into creating a real life book, even if we haven't quite seen it yet. It's no mean feat, and you did it with smiles throughout, so thank you very, very much. It's faintly terrifying honor to kick this off as a chapter editor, but my name's Katie. I co-founded an organization called Now Teach, which recruits older people into teaching, and so I was the chapter editor for Age, and it's very nice, apart from the faint fear, I should say, to go first, because it sometimes feels, and it's first because of the quirk of the alphabet and age, but it sometimes feels that ageism is the sort of forgotten ism. And oddly enough, the National Barometer of Perceptions last year said that 26% of people had experienced ageism, which on that basis simply puts it at higher than any of the other protected characteristics. And yet, I think we don't tend to talk about it, perhaps, as much as we should. We are a massively aging population, as we all know. And it's a peculiar ism, if you like, in another sense, in that it strikes me as above all, as we do it to ourselves. All being well, we will all get old, and yet ageism is deeply entrenched. So we other ourselves in a fashion that is peculiar and strongly internalized, and one that I think we need to do more to challenge, beginning with ourselves, and then of course going outwards. It's the only thing that I can think of, birthday cards and so on, where it's absolutely fine to laugh, not only about other people's age, but also to sort of say, oh, I'm getting old and losing my marbles, all that kind of stuff, which I think one needs to challenge in oneself and not set up the model for the future of ageist attitudes. I have written merely the introduction to this chapter. What we have in here is some incredible voices, some really, really smart people. So I just wanted to quickly list them, and I can't do them justice, but we start with Patrick Thompson, previously of Aging Better, now at Phoenix Insights, who sets the context not just for education, but sort of ageism in the workplace much more broadly. And then we hear from Ian Hunter, who's the CEO of KST Trust, and Joe Brighouse, an experienced classroom teacher with the voice of experience, mature people, and their reflections on age and how it now manifests in the classroom. We then have the brilliant Nikki Bright of Bright Lead, who talks about the menopause specifically and what we need to be thinking and doing about menopause and the way we work with people during that period of life. We then got really interesting perspectives on ageism in ITT. First from Lael McTavish and Isabel Instone from ARC ITT, but also from Richard Lewis and Hugh Ogilvie, who are older ITT trainees, and their perspective of that experience, which I think provide food for thought that we should reflect on. Jane Clearlow gives a brilliant, witty kind of landscape of ageism throughout the school system and the education system. We then have the fantastic Tulika, who founded Edoxa in India, talking about the value particularly of intergenerational mentoring, which is of course a two-way value that is reflected, I know, in so many of the other protected characteristics, this sort of concept of reciprocal mentoring. And finally, Savitri Patel, who writes about age and the way we portray age in literature, which to me seems an understudied topic perhaps, but is important to look at who the older people are that we give access, that we portray to our children in schools and around schools, and what we're telling them. As we all know, we're living longer, and we often see this as a problem, and there are problems with it. We are an ageist country, an ageist world, I would suggest. This one country, we have a rich-poor gap of 19 years in terms of healthy living life. That's to say, women in the richest part of the country might live for 72 very healthy working years, and the poorest country, more parts of the country, more like 53. And I think, therefore, as teachers, we have a sort of double duty, both to ourselves and our colleagues, but also to the children we teach, to ensure that we're not letting them grow up with ageist attitudes, not least because all the evidence, study again and again, shows that if we are ageist, gerontophobia, fear of aging and fear of growing old, ourselves, we will live not only for a shorter life, but a less healthy life. And we need, therefore, to bring children up who will not be ageist either to themselves or to others. Those inequalities map onto educational attainment. And so it feels to me a really important thing that the people who've written so beautifully in this chapter have done to try and change attitudes to aging. Education must be where it begins, and we need to eradicate it to protect both our future selves, but probably more importantly, the children of the future. So thank you very, very much for listening to me. Nerve-wracked to go first. Everyone else will be far better, and I'm fascinated to hear from you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Sorry, Laura, Katie, I should say. I'm reading off the screen. The fascinating thing about this chapter was very much the fact that you're right. It is the forgotten ism, and when people say that is ageism a problem in education? Well, yeah, actually, this chapter really lays it out. So I just want to spend a moment thanking the whole team for thinking about it so carefully. And presenting such a wide range of perspectives on the issue of ageism in education. And I think there are some real takeaways that we can kind of enact straight away in schools that allow people to make practical changes in a way that they perhaps wouldn't be able to do so had this chapter not been written. And you've done a wonderful job corralling everybody and editing it, so a huge thank you to you and the whole of the Age team. Okay, we are going to go on to our next contributor, and our next contributor is a part of the disability team, who have written absolutely brilliantly on this topic. I'd like to introduce Laura McConnell. Laura, are you with us?
I am indeed.
Excellent.
Yes.
I'm going to hand it over to you for your 5 minutes talking about the disability chapter and your contribution.
So firstly, I'd really like to thank both Hannah and Benny, really firstly for creating Diverse Educators, because while I am here as part of the disability team, and actually in my native Scotland, I'm maybe more known for faith work and work around the Catholic community in Scotland as well. I'm multiply diverse. I hit quite a number of those 9 protected characteristics, and that's really the biggest appeal to me for Diverse Educators, is that it's an organisation, a group, a pair that really are recognising that, and recognising though that our cup sometimes overfloweth with identity, as mine does. And it's such a welcoming community to be a part of. And Ruth Golding, who was our chapter editor, is the founder of Disability Ed, and I was really lucky to kind of connect with Ruth really early on in the Disability Ed journey, and we're still getting there. But if any of you are out there and you're not connected with us and you are a disabled teacher, then please do get in contact with us. We want to grow with you. We want to grow in partnership with our Diverse Ed colleagues. So not only did I write with Ruth, I wrote with George, Artemi, Lena, James, Julie, Anya, Rebecca, Liz, and Caroline. And the best thing I think about putting this whole chapter together was actually reading all of their inputs and finding out how similar we were in mindset. We all wrote kind of different, from different perspectives and different topics, but actually we tied that in really well. So some of the contributions in our chapters are pupil-led, or sorry, not by pupil-led, I mean they're about pupils and about how we can support pupils better. Some are about how we can support colleagues better. Some are maybe a little bit more general about the disabled community, and it takes in both of pupils and teachers and educators. But there was so many tie-ins together, and I suppose that all of them were relevant to me. And all of them were relevant to my life. I'm multiply disabled. I wrote in this book about my experience as an autistic teacher. I'm also bilaterally deaf in both ears. I wear hearing aids, and I have a chronic illness amongst many other things, and I also have PTSD. And one of the really good themes, I think, that actually ran through that chapter was about mental health, and about the mental health of pupils and the mental health of disabled educators, and how and pastoral care. And actually, I think that's a theme that from what I've read of other chapters of the book really runs all the way throughout it. If you are slightly different in the education system, be you a pupil or be you an educator, then you are going to run into challenge and you are going to run into conflict, and it's not your fault. And one of the great things is in our second chapter, second part of our chapter, Artemy really breaks down a lot of the parts of the Equalities Act and how that relates to disability. But again, the Equalities Act relates to all of us in this book, and something that I'm really good at telling other people but not good at telling myself is that you are entitled to be a teacher, you're entitled to go to school, and you're entitled to a safe workplace where you are able to thrive because you are capable and you are able to be there. And I'm not always good at telling myself that. And I think that also something that came out of it is one of our lovely writers, Lena, who I work with quite a lot in Scotland, talked a lot about the UNCRC, and I think that that's something that we've tried to ratify in Scottish education and Scottish legislation, and have been ever so slightly blocked by Westminster, to put it in very polite terms, for Saturday morning. And I think that that's something we need to all be more conscious of and be more aware of, that the United Nations Rights of the Child document is there. We are entitled, our pupils are entitled to those rights, and beyond that, we are as adults are entitled to those rights. And it was such a great experience to see all of these educators talking about pupil experience and educator experience and tying that all in there. So I'm so glad I was given this opportunity, and thank you to Hannah and Benny so much.
Thank you, Laura, for speaking today and representing your chapter, and thank you, Ruth, for all the work you've done in supporting your team. I mean, we have to remember that 1 in 5 people in society have a disability. It's a massive proportion of people we're talking about whose needs aren't met. And I've said quite a few times, I've learned more about disability since leaving the school system in the last 2 years than I did in the 19 years where I was a teacher leader and head teacher. And we do need to spend more time thinking about the needs of everybody in the system, and not just the kind of the very quick updates on the first inset day at the start of the year, boom, 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 working through headlines. So thank you so much to the team. Such an important chapter. All of the chapters are important. So the next speaker following Laura is Kit, and I want to say a massive thank you, first of all, to Harry Scantlebury, who is the chapter editor for Gender Reassignment chapter, and the team, who's come down with COVID, all prepped to join us today. I know you're listening, Harry, so thank you so much for your time and effort, and we look forward to having you speak on behalf of the team in the future. And a massive thank you to Kit, who I messaged on Twitter on Thursday night, who agreed to step in at the last minute. So Kit, it's lovely to have you here with us. And this chapter is so important with everything going on in the world right now. So over to you to headline really the gender reassignment section.
Thank you so much. And yeah, Harry, thank you for everything that you've done as our chapter editor. And I hope what I say in the next 5 minutes does you justice, as well as everybody else who's contributed to the chapter. I'm a storyteller. I'm a geographer. I identify as a geographer and identify as a trans person second, but I'm a storyteller. And when I was asked to write about this. So I thought, is this going to be an academic contribution, you know, an academic, you know, which is the thing that's most common. But no, there are so many stories, not just in the gender reassignment section, but also, you know, throughout the book from the bits that I've managed to catch. And that makes it personal, and that makes it real, and it allows context, it allows this intersectionality to take place. And you can tell everybody feels deeply and genuine about what they've written. You only have to look at how, Hannah, you got quite emotional at the start of this. That is pure, that is genuine. You know, that manifests how we all feel about contributing towards this book. In fact, that Benny is sitting there in a car in Wales, like she was never ever going to miss this. She'd be on the top of Mount Everest and she'd still be able to dial in. That's just, all of these are just little clues of what manifests and how it's inside of the book. Now, we know that there's massive amounts of discourse with gender identity, gender reassignment. A lot of it is exceptionally toxic. Is a lot of hostility. There's not much of a, you know, all the evidence suggests that the UK in particular is going backwards with this kind of thing. But I don't want to get political on this. I want to really celebrate what people have contributed to us. So we're really kind of, what's the best way to put it? I think this is everything in this book is very timely. I think the gender reassignment one is exceptionally timely. We are such an intersectional group. And here's the story that I want to tell you. I'm not going to name names because that is not my place. One of the other contributors to the gender reassignment chapter is actually an ex-student of mine. I'm not going to name who that person is. I did not know that they were gender non-conforming or trans while I was teaching this student. Even though I was questioning my gender identity at the time. That must tell you something, that it hasn't been until this person is now an adult, going through their career in life, and now they're coming out finally to be themselves. You have an ex-teacher here who did not start socially transitioning until they'd finished till they came out of the teaching career. And an ex-student of mine didn't feel that. That should tell you quite a few things. I just want to say to that person, I'm very, very proud of them, knowing that I've known them since they were 11 years of age. I stuck all of the key messages, the key points in a word cloud, just because I'm a geek. I like that kind of stuff, right? So I just want to kind of like pick up some of the words that really have come up in these word clouds. So for example, you've got the usual ones, gender, trans, transgender, but there are some really important words that I feel have come out of this whole chapter, and that is cisnormativity. I can never pronounce that one. Inclusive, supportive, relationships. And there's other ones that come out here, like, so identities, diverse, inclusive, teacher, educators, supported, school environment, intersectional conversations, divergence of identity. You know, and in only 5 minutes, I just can't do it justice, the kind of the depth and breadth that all of these go into. So what I've decided to do is I've picked out one thing, one sentence or phrase from each one, right? Because I want to give everybody a shout out. So Tasha Fletcher. So I'm just going to read out these ones. They're out of context because we want you to read the book, right? Tessa, deeply felt internal and individual experience. Kip, intersectional conversations. Kate, ensure teaching and learning is representative. Dylan, being transgender and gender diverse, bring transgender and gender diverse children into the discourse. Char, staff authentic selves. Jamie, reach out to parents. EJ, personal is still political. We can't avoid that. Cal, equitable education. Matthew, ensure that your school is unconditionally inclusive. And in my chapter, visibility paradox. Well, you're just going to have to read it for yourself. But I've been so proud to be part of this, this process, and not just for gender reassignment, but for all the protective characteristics. The strongest message we can all give, really, folks, when you and your allyship, there is nothing about us without us. And Harry, that's for you, Harry, because I know that's a message that you strongly wanted to give across. So thank you, everybody, and and thanks for coming, and I hope you enjoy the book.
Thank you so much, Kate. I know there are lots of people listening at the moment who are feeling quite emotional. And I think, when we talk about impact, your story really does show the impact of this kind of work and why it's so important to have role models. And you talk about stories, and role models comes up over and over again as well. You talked a lot about intersectionality, and I'm going to introduce the next speaker. It's going to be magic, in fact. The speaker is Emma Swift, who is representing the intersectionality chapter of the book. And I'm going to just twizzle the camera.
This is so high tech what we do. As Kit said, we are in a car park in Wales. If we turn it around, we can see the sea. I know everyone's thanked Hannah and Benny, and I also want to thank Hannah and Benny. I spent a lot of time with Benny, and I'm getting to talk about the things that we talk about here. I'm going to lift this up a bit so you don't see the steering wheel quite as much. It has really changed my perception of not just what diversity work is, but of myself. And one of the things that Angie Brown, who edited the chapter, does absolutely brilliantly, is really draw this idea together that actually the idea of intersectionality has a huge impact on people and allows people to actually be their whole selves, but also allows them to meaningfully be supported. And one of the things that hasn't been mentioned up to this point, which I think is really important, is at the end of every section, there is advice about how you can implement this in your own school, in your own setting. And certainly for me, reading this whole chapter, everything is a revelation. And I mean that. Everything is something I don't see and I don't experience. And for me, it just shifts my viewpoint every time I read these, not just not the chapter that I'm in, but also all the other chapters. So I want to thank everybody who's participated, because it is genuinely life-changing. It does show you a different world. So, and it's a great idea and a fabulous book. So thanks, Hannah, and thanks, Benny. Just there. My little section, I'm really kind of reticent to put my head above the parapet, really, and talk about my own experiences. And I was aware very much when I talked about this, I was very clear with Benny, I wanted to talk about my journey through fertility and how my being gay affected that and how it affected it at work. And I think I had a lot of guilt at the time that I didn't realise that I wasn't willing to be really open and say, I'm going through this, and all of the parts of me are finding this difficult, not just the womanness, not just the gayness. And in writing it, it was really quite emotional, because I don't think I'd ever really thought about myself as intersectional. I know Laura talked about this earlier. I think I'd pigeonholed myself. I think the gay bit's a big bit, and then there's the one bit, and there's the other bits. And I think this forced me to really reflect on who I am, and the fact that those different identities aren't separate and don't only exist in different places. I am a whole person with various different protected characteristics. The chapter's fantastic. I really cannot tell you how great it is. And every section talks so differently, and you see a different viewpoint. The talk about how you can drive curriculum and make your schools better in ITT, down to the lived experiences. As I've said, and I think everyone said it, it's a great book. The chapter on intersectionality is a really great addition, in that it does pull everything together and allows people to be themselves. So yes, do read it. It's right. It's great. Totally read it. And thank you again, as ever, for Hannah and Benny, just for keeping working on this. I really appreciate it. And if I can only bring tea, I will continue to do so.
Emma, thank you firstly for joining the book, and also for Benny shoehorning you into speaking today, because I know that you're completely out of your comfort zone, and your narrative is so personal in the book. We really appreciate how everybody has shared deep personal stories to enable other people to learn. So thank you to Emma and Angie and all of the intersectionality team. I'm sure most of you know the story as to why Diverse Ed started. Benny and I were working together. Benny and I were on gate duty one cold 7 o'clock morning, and she said to me, I'm so sick of cutting myself up into 4 and going to 4 events every month. Why do I have to go to Women Ed, BAME Ed, Disability Ed and LGBT Ed? Why can't we have one event? And that's why we started Diverse Ed, to have a whole event for whole people, to have a joined up conversation. So thank you so much for the intersectionality chapter. We really appreciate your contribution to the narrative. Our next chapter we're going to deep dive into, and our next speaker is Jackie Hill. When I met Jackie about 15 years ago, we did not know we were going to be working on a book together, but more than a decade later. And Jackie had the challenge of bringing together a team to talk about marriage as a civil partnership. Another one of the protected characteristics doesn't get a lot of airtime. So Jackie, thank you so much for your time and your effort, and over to you to do some headlines about your chapter.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. And thanks the previous two speakers. I've written things down. I mean, Kit, the importance of stories, you know, that's just absolutely mad. And this idea of shifting viewpoints and different perspectives, that's been my experience in working on this. Just amazing. So I'm going to start with a quote, a very academic quote from Frozen. Wait, you're going to marry someone you've just met? No. That was, of course, Christoph to Anna. And by indicating that this is an absurd thing to do, it's a clear example of how Disney is trying to change how it represents marriage and indeed other relationships. And indeed, our chapter begins with Kieran exploring the theme of the archetypal Disney princess and making a move, imagining a move to a more equitable happy ever after. It's a fantastic way to start the chapter. So, having two small grandchildren now, I'm getting to know Disney all over again. And it's mostly because of them and their mummies that I initially wanted to write for this chapter. When my daughter, who's also a teacher, and daughter-in-law first thought about getting married, there appeared to be so many barriers to them having what so many other people take for granted and in fact turn away from. So is marriage rooted in the family, outside the family, in the state, the church, or is it an archaic patriarchal institution in which women in particular lose their identity, their individuality, and their voice? And Jess and Claire in our chapter look at that in more detail. In fact, across the chapter, you'll find different views, but also some common threads. What we can say with certainty is that marriages and civil partnerships are legal ways that couples can formalize their relationship. They can also overlap with other protected characteristics, sexual orientation, gender reassignment, sex, religion, or belief in race. So you'll find elements in other chapters and laws such as the Human Rights Act 1998. So it's vital, actually, that schools, teachers, senior leaders, and governors have a secure understanding of the range of associated issues, plus appropriate policies and practices in place to ensure that all students and all staff can thrive and feel that they belong. So as employers, schools need to ensure that no member of staff is disadvantaged because of their marital status or perceived marital status arriving out of stereotypical assumptions, but schools need to provide supportive and flexible environments for all, including those with family and other commitments. And Sarah, James and Kate, Sadie and Laura, Amanda all look at this from different perspectives. Now, the legislation actually only covers people who are in legally recognised unions, but schools do have a responsibility to cover those, but all types of long-term relationships. So by the time pupils are at secondary school, they should know that marriage represents a formal and legally recognised commitment, okay, but that there are other different types of committed, stable relationships. All families need the same positive environment, level of support, opportunities, and as someone said earlier, visibility across the curriculum. As Bex writes, it's our duty as educators to always present real families, not just those families that are in front of us. And the contributors across the chapter present a range of perspectives to challenge teachers to think about who is in your lesson, and senior leaders to think about staff and families in your community. As Hale says, by opening up our classrooms to celebrate a diverse range of relationships and families, we give young people the skills and understanding to thrive in our diverse world. The institution of marriage is thousands of years old, but marrying for love is relatively recent. And a bit about the history of marriage is covered by Lois, Amanda, and others. Change has been slow, but since mid-20th century it's been much faster. However, in spite of changes, many challenges remain, including those relating to disabilities, the ongoing impact of Section 28, as well as interfaith, interracial and cross-cultural marriages, all present challenges. So keeping informed and up to date is vital. Also, according to UNICEF, child marriage, that's marriage before the age of 18, is a human rights violation. It still remains widespread. And in this country, children aged 16 and 17 can still get married with their parents' permission. Indeed, some do marry someone they have only just met. So all of these issues illustrate why the compulsory introduction of relationships education in primary school and relationships and sex education, RSE, in secondary schools is so important. Relationships education has to start early, be delivered fully and effectively for all, and embrace diverse families. And finally, a huge thank you to the whole team from whom I've learned so much and who provide a wealth of insights and inspiration throughout the chapter.
Thank you so much, Jackie. It's really, I mean, I love listening to you because you are so well informed about this, and you know the whole team has done a wonderful job at bringing I guess one of the most tricky protected characteristics when we talk about education into the light. And you know, as somebody who's had a civil partnership and a marriage, you know, it was fascinating to read that as a woman who is in a relationship with a woman. And so many of the perspectives resonated, and I do think staff rooms have got quite a way to go before we start talking about marriage and civil partnership in a way that is far more profound than it is right now. So thank you so much. I am going to move on to the pregnancy and maternity team. Now, we had some wonderful contributors to this, and one of those contributors was Claire Neves. I'm going to pass over to you, Claire, so that you can talk about your section.
Thanks, Benny. Hi all. I feel the need to point out that I'm perched in my parents' spare bedroom, and this is not my wallpaper. And really, just that's the most important message to get out today. But seriously, I want to thank Vicky and Alex Fox, who were the chapter editors for the pregnancy and maternity chapter. And I was really, really pleased to ask to contribute. And the first thing that I wrote down to say today has just been cemented by everything that everyone has said so far, and it's something that Vicky and Alex wrote in their introduction to the chapter. People are complex, people have complex lives, people are more than their jobs, and I think that's come through so strongly today, hearing about all of our contributors so far who fit into more of the protected characteristic boxes than we may have thought. And for me, aside from the whole chapter with all of the school culture, the assumptions, the financial issues, the research, things on adoption and IVF, it's such a wide-ranging chapter. The most important thing here is that this book really gives everyone the opportunity to bring their full selves. I know that contributing to the book, I'm really, really proud to be writing for the maternity and pregnancy chapter, but I could have written for several of the other chapters as well. And coming here as a queer, neurodivergent woman who is a mother, it feels really good to be able to bring all of those things and to hear from other authors who've done the same. There's massive overlap between our chapter and other chapters. People have talked about parenting and children elsewhere. Emma's fertility journey is in the intersectionality chapter, which she talked about. And I think that's what's so great about this book. We can't split it into these 9 characteristics, although it's a really, really useful guide through the book. I think there are so many stories, as Kit says. I really, really wanted to focus on quite selfishly, my small part of writing in the book. It's echoed elsewhere in the book, but my part is around how we need to actually go beyond maternity when we're talking about pregnancy, when we're talking about parenting. And I actually felt quite marginalized by some of the language in my own chapter, and that's absolutely not a criticism of the other authors, but it's a comment on how deeply held our cultural norms are. And that's echoed in other chapters where people have talked about fertility, or the cis-centric model, or the heterocentric model that's imposed on everyone, and it's echoed in the marriage and civil partnership chapter as well. So it's absolutely not a criticism, it's just what we're all fed. And you know, Jackie with the Disney princesses talking, it's what we've grown up as, it's what we've been shown is how we're supposed to be. And the my chapter talks about language and making sure that in schools we're not making assumptions about staff, but that we're widening our language as much as possible to include everyone. And that's a really, really difficult thing to do. One of the things that I'm also involved with is the maternity teacher, paternity teacher project. And we have tried to remove unnecessary gendered language from the book, but it's impossible to do that because you have to stick to the wording of the law in many cases. And I know that's something that this book will have sort of come up against as well. You know, you can't change the word maternity when that's what the legislation says. So it's the challenge. But what I don't want schools to become is something that Bex talked about in I think it's the marriage and civil partnership chapter, where they talked about as the gay couple being so pleased when the nursery's response to them being same-sex parents was to buy a book about same-sex families, and they said that their initial elation was replaced by a feeling of, well, why didn't they do it until we got here? And that's really my message to schools. Don't wait until your staff are there and telling you to do it. And I know a lot of the time people can sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable and think, well, how do I find out this information? How do I know what to do without placing the burden on my staff? And this book is just an absolutely fantastic answer to that question. And Mark, one of the authors in the maternity and pregnancy section, said that those of us with stories outside of the norm tend to keep our circles small so that we don't have to keep explaining ourselves to other people. And this book is an absolutely brilliant way of extending those circles, because you can learn from 125 people without placing the burden on them to have to explain themselves over and over. We've written it, we've generously shared our stories with you, and you can read them. You can read all these voices without us having to explain again and again. And school leaders especially need to read the book and take action so that all of us can feel as included as possible in our schools and support the students to feel really, really included, like other panelists have said. So absolutely really thrilled to be here today. And thank you to Hannah and Benny for launching this amazing opportunity.
Claire, thank you. I know you've been part of the journey since the very first event, when we launched Diverse Ed. You've been there from the beginning. And I think the challenge is really fair. Like, Benny and I didn't want this the book to be edited to uphold our beliefs. We like the conflict and the challenge and the dialogue and the debate across the different chapters. I think that's really important. The other thing we talked about was, do we like structuring the website and the book around the Equalities Act and the protected characteristics? Ideally, we shouldn't have to do that, but for the time being, it works. But maybe a future book is, we just think about whole people, whole stories, and we don't tick boxes which chapter we're going to talk about today. So I really appreciate that criticality, Claire. Thank you so much for your time and input. A massive shout out to our co-chapter editors, Modeling, Flexible Working and Co-Leadership, Vicky and Alex Fox, and the brilliant team from Pregnancy and Maternity. Please do get the book and have a look at that chapter as well. His camera has come on, so Sufyan is with us. Sufyan's doing his normal piggybacking. He's at Research Ed Warrington. He's in someone's office. His IT is now working. Suf, over to you to headline the race chapter for us.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, first and foremost, to Hannah and Benny for the work that they've done on this. I know it's been echoed many times, but when they pitched the idea to me, I probably was quietly thinking in my head, they're absolutely mad. to think that they can get this many people together to write something and put it together. But I think that really brings me on to the first and the most important part. It's about, we have many books on the market, and we have many books that cover the issue of race. We have many books that look at it from a very theoretical perspective. We have many books that look at the research that's been covered. We've got many books that are talking about key people, significant authorities on this, or celebrities, or people that have experienced racism. What we don't have is that variety of voices. And I think this is what really made this special for me, because actually it came about at a time that probably when we started to look into this book, race probably was at the forefront of all of the protected characteristics, with everything that was happening with George Floyd and the Black Lives Movement, and what we were experiencing as a nation, but almost globally, around the discussions about equity were back on the table. The discussions around, is person A of Black heritage the same as person B of white heritage? And actually then when you look at that from an educational perspective, it threw up loads of issues, loads of challenges around the lack of less than 3% of people from Black and minoritized backgrounds at headship in UK schools. That's embarrassing. It's abysmal. I've had the pleasure of going into some of the best schools recently. I'll almost name drop it, but I saw Forest Gate, Tamina Begum, Omar at Cumberland. I went up to Eden schools, and these were brilliant BAME leaders running some of the best schools in the country, it must be noted. Not average schools, some of the best schools in the country. And the question has to be asked is, why would Tamina make up 0.1% of Bangladeshi females that can be in headship in this country? What's the problem? And I think the reports that have come out, whether they were pro-government narrative around that there is no problem, there is no systemic issue, I think for us as a group of contributors, it gave us lots of scope to unpack a variety of things. I really enjoyed the chapter and the things that you would really find insightful. Adrian McLean talking about the 4Ds and that powerful personal experience for someone with extensive senior leadership experience, someone who's really lived it and has known what it means to be dismissed, to be discredited, to be demonized, and then eventually destroyed. And actually, that part really resonates with people. That cycle of where people were saying to me when we were talking about this, I'm at this stage, and actually I feel like I'm headed to being destroyed. Albert talking about the labeling of Black students, something that we don't even think about. That actually the problem starts when they're kids, the way we talk about Black boys or Pakistani boys or people from a different background. With Ash Pollard talking about integrating histories. Claire Stewart, again, absolutely, I haven't seen Claire on there, but I've learned so much from Claire around looking at the theories, around the texts that are out there, but her looking at institutional racism and whiteness in schools. And actually really powerful having someone from a white background on that group. It was really important that it wasn't just ethnic minorities talking about it. We've got Ebony addressing racial abuse by pupils. Again, something we've never really considered. When we talk about the issue of racism, school, education, and race, we don't talk about what it means to be called the N-word or the P-word by a child in your classroom and no action is taken or insufficient action is taken. What is the impact on a teacher? What's the impact on all the other pupils in that class? Janetta talking about Black females teaching English and looking at some of the challenges around that. Jessica, Dr. Jess talking about culturally relevant pedagogy that actually can be adapted. I'm at Research Ed, and my work today was around CPD. And actually the one thing I've really learned is actually depending on the profile of young people that you have, you can change your pedagogy to get brilliant outcomes. So when people see certain people doing really well, they do exceptionally well. And I think that kind of brings me to an end. And I want to just really thank Laura, Ria Gibbs, Sharon Porter, who did some brilliant work on that chapter. And just a huge thank you to be a part of an amazing book and being able to speak about real people and real stories. Thank you, Benny. Thank you, Hannah.
Again, really good summary of the chapter and some of the really deep and meaningful issues that come out of it. And you know, we heard from some people we hadn't heard from before in this debate, and it was expertly managed by yourself. So thank you so much to the whole team on race. I am now going to introduce David Hermit, who was our hugely capable editor of the team on religion and beliefs. David, over to you for your thoughts.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here joining you on this prestigious occasion. It's fantastic to see so many people who have contributed to this work, and this chapter is no different. A Muslim parent once said to me when I was head of a church school, they said, "I want my child to attend a school where faith in God is respected." I think one of the challenges with religion and belief is that it's a very complex area. And because it's a complex area, people don't really want to talk about religion. It's ever important, it's ever relevant. Something like 85% of the world's population subscribe to some sort of religious belief system. And the majority of us do believe in God. We do pray. We do humanitarian activities because of our belief and our faith. And I'm one of those as well as a Christian. And so what we have is we have a society in school which is made up of children and adults who may have the same or very different religious convictions. And we as school leaders are faced with the challenge of ensuring that everybody is treated with respect and tolerance. That doesn't mean that we always will agree with one another about certain points, and there are certain church schools who struggle in tackling some of the issues that we've been discussing today. But they are very much understanding that they have to follow the law and they have to be peacemakers. They have to do the things that are necessary to ensure that whatever our beliefs might be, that we can all work together positively in the life of a school. When our team came together, we discovered really that there were three key areas that we could write about. And so there were teams of us that were looking at different things. And so one team was looking at the culture of leadership. And within that team, we had Philip, Jackie, Esther, and Aisha. And they wrote a little bit more about what it is in terms of leading a school and institution. How do we ensure that we get that balance right? Philip Smith is an academic, a British academic who's actually working across at Columbia University in New York. And he sort of brought really this understanding about the spiritual journey of a leader and how that might contribute towards how they might tackle this issue. Jackie Newsom, she's a head teacher, she's on a second headship actually, and also an Ofsted inspector. And so she's very, very aware as a Black woman in a church environment as well, about how we need to find a balance that stays within the law. And she struck some really good questions, really, as she discussed about what it's like to lead a multi-faith school. Esther Cummins is a teacher trainer. And so she picked up on some of the themes that we picked up earlier around there's just a lack of training and support for teachers in understanding how to navigate this area. And Christian values and religious pluralism are just things that we sometimes just don't think about as part of our training. And when we talk about cultural capital in Bordeaux, we talk about almost a white privileged sort of cultural capital that's brought into schools, rather than acknowledging that there are cultural capital that comes from those who have other world religions that should be brought into school as well, and often is forgotten. And some of the work that Sufyan spoke about just before, about how racism plays itself out, really does link very, very closely with our Asian community. And, you know, it's sometimes interchangeable. Some of the work that I'm doing in my PhD shows very clearly that if you are someone of Asian origin, you are more likely to take your religious beliefs more seriously than someone who is from one of the other ethnic groups. Aisha particularly, therefore, talked about interfaith dialogue and how important it was that we should learn to understand religions that are not our own. The second group was looking really at the feelings of belonging. And those feelings of belonging both go for the adults within our school community, but also the students. What does it feel like to be brought up in a sectarian environment in Northern Ireland? Orla McKeating talks about the mental health issues that go with that, and about post-traumatic stress disorder and all the other things that have happened in Northern Ireland. Sometimes religious belief can be a good thing. It can lead us to humanitarian acts, but it can also divide us. How do we ensure that that doesn't happen? George, as a transgender Catholic RE teacher, I'll say that all again because it's a mouthful, a transgender Catholic RE teacher, he's in the forefront of having to live out what it is to be all of those different persona within the context of a faith school. And he talks about that. And then Elizabeth Walsh-Hayuma talks about feminist theologians and about the need to consider the least in our society. And as we talked about intersectionality and some of the other passages, we've spoken really about the least. Who is it who ends up at the bottom of the pile? It's quite often a woman. It's quite often a Black woman. And so what we end up therefore with is this sort of hierarchy that has been built around our schools that we need to do some work towards dismantling. The final group, we're looking at some questions. I love some of these questions. You look like a nun. That's a question that's been posed to Anjum Pierbakos. And she is sort of talks about how the Muslim faith is really worked out in schools. How do we allow people to display their faith by what they wear and how they look? Nazra is a primary school teacher, and she spoke about a question that was asked of her is, what's that on your head? And being visible about her faith in what she wears on her head. And finally, Alison Zions talks about what it feels like to be a Jewish teacher in school, what it feels like when the only thing that we talk about Jews is the Merchant of Venice or the Holocaust. Surely we can do better than that in the way in which we phrase things in our school lives, so that all of these communities can feel that they are part of our curriculum and that they belong. So what we have, I think, in our chapter is something that's worth reading. I believe that the contributions that my colleagues have made will help us to think more deeply about how, if we are leaders, like myself, I've done 33 years as a leader. I'm one of that 3%, I think, that someone mentioned of Black leaders in our system who have been head teachers. And I think a smaller percentage who have gone on to be CEOs as well. And to what extent is our system rigged against actually people with religious beliefs, and in particular
David, I'm going to have to stop you there if that's okay. Thank you so much for your input, and thank you so much to David and the team on religion and beliefs. I missed the beginning because my Wi-Fi cut out, but I'm not sure if you said, David, that this was one of the hardest chapters to find 10 people who wanted to write about religion and belief. It's not something we necessarily talk about in educational circles. We don't need people to talk about our events or blog about religion and belief. We've been taught to hold this part of us inside. So thank you so much to the 11 of you for really surfacing some of the narratives, and we hope in the future to have more and more narratives amplified at our events and through our blog, and hopefully future books as well. So thank you so much, David. Our next speaker, I'm going to introduce Jeremy Davies, who is one of the contributors to the chapter for sex. And I'm sure he's going to talk about even the problematic title of that protected characteristic. Rachel Elgie, who was our chapter editor, is actually on her hen do today, so I hope you're having a great hen do, Rachel. Jeremy, over to you to represent your team.
Thanks very much for the introduction. It's lovely to be with you on this sunny Saturday. So when my 22-year-old son asked me what I was up to this weekend, his face was quite a picture when I told him I was going to be giving a talk about sex. The good news is for all of us that I'm not here to talk about sex. Instead, I'm here to introduce the sex chapter of this brilliant book, which I didn't edit, by the way. That job, as Hannah just said, fell to Rachel LG. And what an excellent job she's done. The chapter covers all sorts of ground that will hopefully help us all build a more diverse and inclusive education system. It's written by 10 of us: Virginia, Anne-Louise, Yamina, Alexander, Anita, Lindsay, Nina, Patrick, Diana, and myself. And together, what we've pulled together, I think, is a huge breadth and depth of well-argued ideas around sex as a protected characteristic that could transform teachers' working conditions and work-life balance and help us broaden children's understanding of who they are and who they can be. So you'll find sections here on flexible working, parenting leave, breaking down gender stereotypes in the early years and sport, different approaches to closing gender pay gaps in education, womanhood and motherhood and the strength of women, and the ideas for how men in the education sector can act as allies in the fight for gender equality. So it's a chapter that pulls no punches. And to set the scene, there's a really useful introduction which does an excellent job of defining sex and gender and how they overlap. Rather than trying to summarize it, I'm going to leave you to read that for yourselves. So you may be wondering, why on earth have they got a bald 53-year-old white guy talking about the sex chapter of a book on diversity and inclusion, which is a fair question. I mean, I am surely part of the problem we're trying to fix here, right? I represent the very demographic that holds the power, sets the rules, pays themselves more, perpetrates more violence, and so on and so on. Well, all of that is true. And as a middle-aged, middle-class, cis white man who grew up in one of the richest countries on planet Earth, I guess I pretty much hit the jackpot for privilege. Almost, but not quite, because I am also gay, so I get to lay claim to a little bit of lived experience of feeling marginalized. But in fact, in the part of my life that I hold most dear, which is fatherhood, it's actually my maleness more than my gayness that has felt like the biggest source of exclusion. We're surrounded, all of us, by narratives about fathers being useless, cack-handed, not interested. We're not doing enough childcare and housework. But there's practically no acknowledgement that all our systems are designed to push us as boys and men away from caring roles and into workplaces. Our society comprehensively and lazily conflates caring with femaleness, and I might add, with low pay. I think that bringing men into the parenting space, and as I argue in my piece in the chapter, into early years education, is the other side of the coin to what most of the rest of the chapter rightly focuses on, which is the battle for women to be taken seriously and treated fairly in workplaces. These are problems, like most in the sex chapter, that will require determined, systemic, and sometimes radical action if we're to solve them. And if we don't, we're never going to achieve equality between the sexes. But we'll miss other benefits too. Somebody much cleverer than me once said that world peace begins on the nappy changing table. And I think there's something in that. For me, there is no nobler pursuit than looking after and educating children. And I'd go so far as to say that normalizing male participation in this stuff could be key to our future as a species. People who routinely spend their days eyeball to eyeball with young children tend to understand the beauty and value of human life and nature, and tend not to want to ruin all that by waging wars and pursuing greed. So if I had to identify a theme that connects the 11 pieces in this chapter, I'd say it's this: that whatever our biological makeup, wherever we sit on the gender spectrum, we're all individuals with our own unique skills, talents, and aspirations. And we should be free to make our own choices, find our own truths, and shape our own lives without being boxed in by stereotypes about boys and men being like this and girls and women being like that. As educators, we're central to this agenda. If we can't get it right for ourselves and for the children we're educating, what hope is there for the future?
My goodness, thank you so much, Jeremy. Listening to you, it really, that sense of responsibility we have as adults to create the future that we want for our children and for other people's children just completely rings through in what you're saying. And there's a lot of comments in the chat that are echoing my comments, and the fact that you've really hit some nails on the head there. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to our last contributor, who I know has been sitting excitedly in the wings. It is the indomitable Nick Kitchener-Bentley, who is going to talk about the sexual orientation chapter. Happy to have you with us as always, Nick. Over to you.
Thanks, Benny. Happy to be here as well. I've never been called indomitable before, but I appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you so much, Benny and Hannah, for the work that you've done in putting together this book, which I know is an incredibly valuable text and will be so useful to so many people. So a big thank you. And from my point of view, a big thank you to Professor Jonathan Glazard for his work in editing this chapter, and also all of our different contributors to our chapter. So Amy, Andrew, Daniel, Sean, Carly, Jack, Lisa, and Mayor. It's been really interesting to read your contributions and have those conversations. So a big thank you for all of that. This really is, in my view, an important piece of writing, and I'm so pleased that, with such a huge, deeply rich contribution from so many different people, that it will be read widely. I want to begin just by outlining the importance in my mind of talking about diversity with respect to sexuality in education. It is undeniable, and it is backed up by a huge wealth of studies, that LGBTQ+ young people and staff disproportionately experience challenges in the education system when compared against those who are not part of the community. However, and despite vilification in quite a hostile press environment at times, charities such as Stonewall and Just Like Us have done impressive research that's actually shown that when we do work to promote diversity, equity and inclusion for these groups, it can improve those outcomes. It can improve the experiences that young people and staff experience in education system. In this chapter, we've reflected on some of the work that we can be doing to help all young people, and we've described some of our own experiences too. And I think that I feel really optimistic about this. I feel that there's a very optimistic tone in our chapters, and I believe that we can face down the challenges that I'm talking about. In referring to an increasingly hostile press environment, I have, of course, alluded to the challenging context in which we find ourselves. Everyone who supports inclusive education, and in particular LGBTQ+ equality, but transgender and non-binary people have all too often experienced the sharp end of this. It's a vicious onslaught, in my opinion. And although the chapter is focused on the theme of sexual orientation, many of us who've written have also written about trans people in our work. And whilst those of us who are cisgender could never speak on behalf of trans people, it is, in my mind, imperative that we kind of signal our solidarity with this community. Erasing trans and non-binary people who are actually LGBTQ as well. Some of even tried to pit those of us with diverse sexual orientations against people with diverse gender identities. But historically, we know that trans people have been integral in the fight for LGBTQ+ equality. And I want to affirm my support, and I know so many people in our community do, for trans people, because it is the overwhelmingly dominant position within our community. So with that in mind, which different intersecting identities are important to centre within this community? Well, in my opinion, LGBTQ+ people are, of course, across all of the protected characteristics. And I think we need to consider some of those intersections, including gender, disability, gender diversity, ethnicity, religion, and faith. And of course, all kinds of combinations of these. There are lots of different intersecting identities that are covered in this book. And whilst, of course, we've got a really great chapter where we try to do as much as we can, it would be impossible for us to do the entire totality of all of this. But what I do believe that we have done in a really helpful and meaningful way is made a substantial contribution towards this, and one that I really hope will involve lots of different people moving forwards, so that people feel empowered to involve themselves in. And as I reflected on the different contributions that people within our chapter have made, it seemed to me that three key themes are emerging. Interestingly, like Kit said, story, but also identity and power. So the stories that we tell ourselves and we tell the young people that we work with. thinking about, of course, our own identities as well, and the rich tapestry of educators that exist out there, and identity as well, our own identities, the identities of the people that we teach about, and of course the identities of the people that we teach. It's really important, and we cover that in our chapter as well. But power is essential to all of this in my mind. The power of doing this work, the power of ensuring, yes, that it is properly funded, and establishing genuine support from people who are in power. Whilst our community is one that has been historically marginalised, this opportunity to redress the imbalance of power becomes even more important. As I've said, sadly, the experiences of young LGBTQ+ people and staff all too often involve discrimination, mental health challenges, and inequity. And we know that these challenges can be amplified and experienced in different ways for those people's whose identities are reflected across the protected characteristics. Whilst this chapter does not seek to downplay any of that, in my opinion, what it offers is a really powerful antidote to it, because by opening out our personal experiences, sharing powerful research and grounding it in the kind of the theories of social justice, I believe that we have shown that these injustices that are faced by so many people can be challenged, and we can do so much better. And in my opinion, if LGBTQ+ people and all of our allies and everybody interested in the fight for diversity and equity and justice strive to ensure that the work we do is ensuring that every single young person and member of staff is celebrated, supported and championed, then we can build a better world for every single person. And surely that's what we want to do. Thank you so much. Can't wait to read the book. And thank you, everyone. Really great afternoon.
Nick, thanks for bringing the energy, but also channeling the energy into a call to action for everybody to stand in solidarity and to be allies for all of the different identities we don't hold. So thank you so much for contributing. Thank you so much to Professor Jonathan Prassard for editing that chapter, and thank you to all of the voices. And I know for a number of people who've contributed, like they felt quite unsafe even sharing their stories in the book, and we really hope that the book keeps you safe, and we'll do what we can to make sure that nothing gets taken out of context as well. So thank you to all of our speakers today for bringing to life the 10 sections. We are going to move to Q&A, so I'm just going to see what questions we have in the chat. So the first question, Benny, you can take this one. How can we extend the reach of the book? Diverse Ed is amazing and does so much, but not everyone accesses the internet or Twitter or Instagram. Thoughts, Benny?
So that is the eternal question, isn't it? Because, you know, we think that the world is on Twitter, we think that the world is in our networks, but actually, I think I heard that only 5% of teachers are actually on Twitter. And if you think about how many schools are not accessing this information, it's actually a wealth of opportunities out there to actually go out and sing the praise of the book. And quite a lot of time that happens through word of mouth. You know, when we go to a school, we say, actually, look, have you heard of this? You don't have to be on Twitter. You can be on LinkedIn. You can be on Mighty Networks Network. You can be on Facebook, and you can be on Instagram, and you can look into this organization, and this is the book that they wrote. But like I said earlier, I think for me, it's making sure that this book isn't just word of mouth, it's actually encoded into ITT. You know, where we have teachers at the start of their careers reading this book, and that forming the basis of their understanding about equity in education, that's what's going to be the reach of the book, I think. And you know, we know that it will either sell really well or it won't. It's not really about the money. We know that you don't make very much money from these things, but the more we can pass that message on as a community about what the book does and how the book is going to change schools for the better, we can make the biggest difference here.
Yeah, totally agree. And that's why we did the book, because we are very aware that not everyone's on Twitter, not everyone's on the website, not everyone's on the blog. And hopefully just having that copy in the staff room or in the staff library will open up those conversations in those spaces that perhaps are still in a little bit of a bubble. Laura, I'm going to ask you to answer the next question, if you don't mind. So a question from one of our international school colleagues, really excited about the book, but in terms of application, how do you think some of the chapter advice might translate in an international setting? What's your thoughts around that, Laura?
I think that actually, in terms of the Equality Act, from what I know about USA law and Irish law, and actually some European laws, were not always that dissimilar. And in fact, actually the USA, which many of us may deride for many reasons, actually in disability terms have much stronger protections in place, and actually have much stronger protections. I think that really, if you're in an international setting, and many of us are, you have to really make yourself familiar with local law, make yourself, and actually, I'm sorry, actually, even being British, make yourself familiar with the law, make yourself familiar with legislation, and remember that legislation is there to serve you. There will be countries where it is slightly different. However, there will also be international schools who may, particularly I'm thinking the Middle East, who will follow a British model and will also have additional protections in there. And that's really a rights conversation that you need to have with them when you get there. If we are teachers, we're capable of looking up this, but it is overwhelming. And there's a lot of support out there. And if you feel overwhelmed, get on Twitter, get on LinkedIn, get on Instagram, and say to people, I'm moving to whatever country, I'm in whatever country, someone who's there, help me, tell me what I need to know. There's so many of us there that want to help you.
Thank you, Laura. And there are some brilliant international contributors within the book, thinking about same-sex marriages, for example, and working in Thailand. I know that was one of Sadie and Laura contributed to one of the sections on that. So hopefully some of the narratives, and maybe that's something for us to think about in a future publication, that we get more international voices. Kit, do you want to jump on that question? You're on mute, darling.
Yeah, so I answered it by text, but just for the benefit of everyone else, didn't probably got my my response. So sorry to go all geography teacher on you all here, right? But at the end of the day, no matter where you live in the world, as crude as the boxes are for the Equality Act, these 9 protected characteristics, they are just representative, not just the British people, they're representative of the entire human race. You know, every country, culture has, you know, well, they might not have the representation, but they have these people exist. Okay, there are plenty of cultures around the world where they do have 3rd or more genders, for example, and they have done at least until the age of colonialism anyway. So you will find, you know, a representation for your school there. So, and we've talked about it quite a lot. There's so much intersectionality. So if there is one aspect of this which is problematic, you know, there are parts of the world where people like myself can't go because we could be arrested or worse. There are still some ways, there's still some intersectionality there, which can still bring in the conversation and make that flow. So what I've said here is when you read through, I will guarantee you that you'll recognize some of your colleagues and your students throughout this book, no matter where you are in the world.
Yeah, brilliant point, Kit. Thank you so much. David, I'm going to ask you to do the next question, if you don't mind. So Artemis mentioned that when the Index for Inclusion was first published, the DfE had a copy sent to every school in England. I mean, how might we go about getting policymakers or the government to actually look at this book or think about this book and think about the placement of this book?
Difficult question to answer, because our government tends to have its own views on the importance of this work. We are in a period now where those views are flip-flopping between the sort of extremist views, where sometimes some of the issues that are within this book are vilified and are not really promoted amongst government circles. And I hope that we are now at a point where they will see that it's not enough just to have a law that says that equality should happen in schools, but there should also be a plan that backs up all of that. And it feels to me as if this book might provide a manifesto potentially for what that plan should include.
Thank you, David. Sophie, I can see your camera's come on. Do you want to add anything to that, Soph, about how we might engage in dialogue with the DfE?
Yes, I think we need to keep beating the drum and need to carry on. I think having a book makes a lot of difference, because actually having a text that's going to now emerge and hopefully feature in a lot of CPD libraries across our schools, whether they want to ignore it, they can't ignore it. And I think that's the power of a book, that actually it's not a book of Benny and Hannah's opinions. This is a book of over 120 contributors. This is a significant number of people that represent the landscape around diversity, and therefore actually it's the biggest statement thus far in our drive and push as a collective around equality, for us to say, right, actually this is the views here, have the book. We need to start looking at this more systemically around what we need to do, of what we need them to do from the DFE beyond statements of intent, but actual action that needs to be taken.
Thank you, Scythian. And when Benny and I framed it and sort of like did the kind of the guides, that practical application was absolutely key. But some of you have also referenced the kind of the theoretical. Like sometimes DEI can feel quite soft and quite fluffy. It's lots of personal stories, and that's why we wanted to really sort of like anchor the practice in the theory as well. So we're hoping that marrying, I saw the hand there, that marrying up of the practical and the theoretical was the kind of the aim of the game, with those takeaway questions, those takeaway actions. So I'm going to ask the next question to Claire, Nick and Jackie. I'll ask you all to respond to this question, and then we're going to wrap up the Q&A. So Raj has asked, what would you say are the key messages for school leaders, including governors, to start to take this forward in real, effective and practical changes and actions from now? So Claire, what do you think some of the key messages for the leadership teams and the governance are?
Firstly, I think read the book, and I'm not being flippant there. I am just echoing what I said earlier around, you know, this is such a wealth of information. Those 125 voices, you know, you can't dismiss it as the voices of a few people who are really, really interested in DEI. This is over 100 people's experience. And I think, you know, if you're a school governor somewhere, as loads of us in education often are in other schools, don't underestimate how significant a position that is in terms of being able to influence the leadership of a school and get this on the agenda. You know, as governors, although it doesn't always work this way in practice, unfortunately, governors are supposed to set the agenda for those governing body meetings. Ask for something like this to be put on the agenda, get it in there. If you're a member of SLT, get it on your SLT leadership agenda, make sure it's in the CPD library. And then really school leadership need to be taking this forward so that we're not in a position of marginalised people to be advocating for ourselves, but we're in a position as allies to be able to go in and advocate for those who are more marginalised than us or marginalised in different ways. You know, it needs to be up to those of us who can advocate in different areas, so that it doesn't just see, you know, I don't want to always be going into my head and saying, what are we doing about LGBT inclusion? You know, I want my colleagues to do that for me, and I'm going to be going in and saying, look, this is a good idea of something we could be doing for our colleagues who are marginalised in a different area. So school leaders really need to just not dismiss this if it doesn't affect them directly, and be open to just how many of their staff it really does affect.
Thank you, Claire, so much. Jackie, do you want to add anything to that, the call to action for governors and leaders?
Really agree with everything that Claire has said. I guess maybe perhaps targeting one or two things that whenever the book is being handed over or given over within the context of the school, think as a starting point which elements you might want to put a marker in and say start there, rather than sort of trying to, if you like, get them to digest it all in one go. Have a look at one element that's particularly relevant, or one or two. The other thing is, whenever we talk about SLT, it's everyone in SLT. It's not that one person who is responsible for, and I think that that's really important, and it's the same across the school, and also in terms of the school community, to remember it's about staff and it's about students, and to sort of really look at how that would be targeted, where the work needs to be done in those two areas.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm going to finish for you, Nick. And Yamina was tweeting this morning, like, your school gets a shout out in the opening to the book, because at the very first Diverse Ed event, I remember the four of you getting in the car, driving up from East London, going back to school, launching a Diverse Ed group. How might your Diverse Ed group at Sarah Burnell's school use this book? How might you go next week and have a conversation with the governors or with the SLT?
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for the shout out. And I'm pleased to have that shout out for Yamina, who's got a brilliant chapter in here, and for Becky, who's on the call, and who both do great work in this area in our school. We do work here because we think it's important and we think we have to do it. So we have our discussion group, we have discussions at different levels within our school. I think it's going to be absolutely integral. What I want us to be able to do, and I think Yamina has already alluded to it in the chat, is to be able to get everybody genuinely in the community properly involved in these conversations, so that we can carve out the time so that it is in there. It needs to be a priority, this kind of work. So get it in twilights, so where we have that CPD, it's there, and it's really, really important. Because when I was hearing about some of these conversations and these kind of pieces of feedback that people were making, I was thinking, gosh, yes, there's so much that schools have to do. How are you going to do this? This is about every single person in your school. That's what it is meant by EDI. It's about every single person in your school and college. We have to prioritize that work. And I can't wait to see what we're going to do. And I can't wait to see what everyone across the country is going to do. It's going to be brilliant.
Thank you, Nick. Benny, thank you so much, Nick. Benny, what's the call to action for everyone today?
I think for me, it's very much, I mean, I've been seeing it in the chat already about what people are going to do to try to support this book going out into the wider world. And I think we just take a moment to, to those captive audiences that we do have on Twitter, for example, to really show them what those pledges are. Your passion has come across in the chat, but can you pledge what you're going to do in that public sphere, whether that's on LinkedIn, whether that's on Instagram, whether that's on Facebook groups? Just take a moment now to recognize what your pledge.
I think the Wi-Fi in the Welsh car park might have finally let you down, Benny.
My connection is probably not particularly stable right now, so I hope.
No, we lost you a little bit, so I'm just going to repeat that. But in the chat, you've got the hashtag #MyDiverseEdPledge.
Can't hear me.
Benny, we've lost you, darling. I'm just going to repeat that. So please use that hashtag. Please use the camel case to make sure that anyone using voice readers can actually read the hashtag. Please just find a social media platform you are on and pop out a My Diverse Ed pledge and start those conversations on all those different social media platforms. We'd really, really appreciate that amplification. And the final things I just want to say is that we really apologise if you've not yet received your copy. We had a little bit of a delay with distribution. We've seen a few copies got delivered on Friday. I think Ali Onions was the first person to get a copy of the book. Benny and I haven't even seen it yet. So please look out for your post person and hopefully your book will arrive. If you've not yet ordered your book, I'm going to send out a 25% discount code to order it from Legend, our publishers, so you can order the book there. It would be remiss of us not to do a massive thank you to Dr. Jill Berry, who had a pre-copy of the book and who has tweeted out every single day for the last 10 days. She's read all of your sections. If you don't follow Jill Berry on Twitter, please do so, and please look for her individual extracts from every single one of the contributors from the book. And we've had no reviews yet on Amazon. We tend to hooked, waiting for the reviews to start coming in. So as and when you do read it, please do put your reviews on there. Let's see if we can knock Benny off the best-selling chart and get our book up there on the top 10 in the books on Amazon, or at least place 1 and place 2 would be good enough. So finally, a massive, massive thank you to all of our speakers today, to all of our chapter editors and contributors, to our publishers. It has been a full-on 2 years. We really appreciate your time, your energy, and your input. And we look forward to seeing the conversations as the books are read and are distributed. So go and enjoy what's left of your Saturday, and we'll be in touch via email in a few days' time. Thank you very much.